I was surprised to see them here. It's the one place in Ingold where they appear. People got really into them for a while, back in the day. But for anthropology, they're a little bit out there. There they are. Deleuze apparently was a philosopher, and Guattari was a psychoanalyst. And like I said, I was a bit surprised to see them in Ingold. It's the only place he mentions them. I'm not sure why, actually, they're there. I mean, you're right. They have this rhizome, and because Ingold is interested in these rhizomatic metaphors, I think he was drawn to them. But later on, like I said, he wrote another series, a collection of essays called Being Alive, which I once tried to assign to a first year seminar with the same title, Being Alive. And it was tough, I have to say. We were trying to do all these Ingoldian things. I was trying to make it more active than my usual classes, but never tried it again. And I think that in some ways, the reason I stick with this book is because for me, it does the same thing, except more schematically. But in that place, Ingold mentions his how he found Deleuze. Admittedly, my initial attempts to read Deleuze, prompted by the recommendations of many friends and colleagues, led nowhere. So a lot of people told him to do it, but he couldn't. Finding the work all but incomprehensible, I abandoned these attempts in sheer frustration, but then later on finds out that they had something to do with all these lines, and he got really very into lines. Anyway, these two are, like I said, they're more probably associated with philosophy, postmodernism. People got really into them for a while. Not so much with anthropology, although people would start to cite them. There they are. If you dig into Ingold's footnotes or endnotes in this chapter, he says that he thinks that it's not necessarily, the rhizome should actually be, the better image would be a fungal mycelium, which is rhizomatic, but in a fungal way, I guess. Maybe he's drawing on his dad's work there. And there's a really interesting parallel with this blogger who is writing about Ingold and Deleuze and gives a fungal mycelium image. But he also talks, and this to me was really interesting, especially since we're in the history of anthropological thought, about Ralph Linton's book on the tree of culture. And so this is endnote number 9, where he talks about how Linton and others like Kroeber were using this tree imagery, but it wasn't in the same hierarchical lines and points trees that, or it didn't have to be the line and point tree. And so if you read really closely, Linton's tree was actually the banyan tree, which is a kind of an well, I guess it's not the tree that we would usually associate with it. So that the story, this was the tree of culture, the story of man from the dawn of prehistory to the beginnings of the modern era. A brilliant history of how societies began. My middle-aged eyes can't even do it. Began with common roots. There it is. Grow into separate organisms, yet continue they continue. Maybe I can read it better there. Aha, there it is. Rerooting, growing, interrelating until, like the banyan tree, they become an entire forest that remains a single tree. So what Ingold was saying is this tree imagery that we have, it doesn't have to be hierarchical. And so what he says here about Deleuze and Guattari is they wanted to liberate us from hierarchical thinking through their rhizomes. But his idea is that we sort of root ourselves in real experience. And so it wasn't a philosophical or incomprehensible project, but the projects of getting back into real experience. So again, I don't know if he needed Deleuze and Guattari to write this chapter, but the metaphors were probably so similar that he felt like he needed to refer to them. So this chapter is in some ways one of Ingold's most schematic, most it's very simple to know that if you read anything on pages 134 through 139, the 5 terms of the genealogical model, that then if you retake up the terms on pages 140 to 149, anything that he said back in 134 to 139 is probably going to be argued against later. And sometimes you probably could just almost skip up to the relational part, because he often then goes back and rehearses the arguing against part of the genealogical model. But it's in some ways these ideas are so rich here, and we can only cover a little bit of them. But in some ways it helps because it's all kind of laid out in a, you might even say, a hierarchical way. It's not very rhizomatic in that sense. Now, it's very much, like I said, it's very rich and it's in the field of ideas, but I do want to point out that there are some very real consequences of the imposition of a genealogical model. So on page 137, he's talking about how if indigenous, the problem is that when you use descent as the criteria for who is indigenous and who is not, there's always this fractionality, you know, how many ancestors count in order to make someone indigenous or not. In our country, in the United States, this had to do also with who counts as black or white, and there were laws about one great grandparent, or the infamous one drop rules. But there were also all these fractional ideas about how much ancestry you had to have to categorize a person as one or the other. And so, as Ingold says, these lead to these lines of discrimination and exclusion. And it parallels something back that I asked you to flag back in early Brody, where Brody talks about some people, when women got married to when indigenous women would marry white people, they would lose their band attachment. And so you might have the same, you know, on page 28 or 27, 28 of Brody. Indigenous women who married white men automatically lost their band membership, as did their children. This did not apply to indigenous men who married white women. They, along with their children, were entitled to be band members. But you can, I mean, speaking of the line, I mean, in that sense, you're talking about a gendered quantification of ancestry in which it passes down through one line but not the other, at least in a legal sense. Between 1955 and 1975, over 12,000 Canadian Indians, of whom 10,000 women and their children, thus ceased to be Indian under the law. And Brody says that a lot of these people insist that they are indigenous in everything but legal name, which again, makes you think about, in some ways, these ideas, somebody does not have to have a certain quantum of ancestry. I mean, they've been excluded based on an extreme application, we might say, of the genealogical model. So Ingold examines here 5 different terms, and in my presentation, instead of going through the 5 terms and on one model and the other, I'll try to juxtapose each in the next to each other instead of one by one as he does it. So we'll see if we can bring out something a little bit different. So again, going back to the Deleuze and Guattari metaphors, that the tree genealogical model are things that are passed down in a sort of point-to-point way along those familiar, perhaps to us, kinship charts of anthropologists. And that there is a distinction between people who are basically of, or, the being indigenous would mean you were of or in the land, and the people who are moving on the land, the settlers or the colonists who are moving on or over the land. And as Gabe has told us, in the relational model, we have this rhizomatic intertwining, and your ancestors are nurturing you a dense and tangled cluster. So if we skip up to page 140, so instead of this point-to-point thing, you have this dense and tangled cluster. And I think what's interesting here, at least reading it this time, is that we think, or in the genealogical model, our ancestors are, we have our parents, and then we go back and generate, they're all human. And Ingold is saying here that there are many possible ancestors, the sheer multiplicity of possible ancestors. So you can have ordinary humans who lived in the past, that seems familiar, spirit inhabitants of the landscape, mythic other than human characters, or original creator beings. And so he then goes into examples of all of these. And what he says is that in all of these cases, what these beings are doing are providing nurturance and guidance. The nurturance they provide to establish the necessary conditions in the environment for their children's growth and development, which actually goes back to what we were reading about the horticulture of providing the conditions for growth. So you might even throw some of the horticultural societies in here as having, and Ingold discusses this a little bit, that just because you're growing things in the earth and are farmers and are concerned with ancestry, that doesn't mean you have necessarily adopted this genealogical model, which he sees to be as a much more modern idea. And so what he's saying here is that there are all kinds of possible ancestors, and it's not that they have handed down something to you or transmitted something to you. Even the human ones are it's because of what they have done to set up the conditions for your growth. As on page 141, grandfathers are ancestors because they were there before you, because they guide you through the world. In that sense, you follow them, but you're not descended from them. So you are being guided by them and by grandfathers. This includes the sun, the 4 winds, the masters of various animal species that would be equally ancestral in this sense, or seen as ancestors. So in terms of the idea of generation, what happens? I think we all are familiar with the genealogical model of generation, in which life starts and it's sort of done. We get into all these arguments about when actually life starts, but the idea is it begins at a certain point, and that something is we'll talk about that in terms of substance, but what happens is that you are the product of your blood or your genes, and it has very little to do with your experiences or your life. And then, of course, at the end of it, that's done. Death is the end of your life. So then you start, get your genetic components, and you live out your life, but that doesn't really matter so much. And then when it's over, it's over. Sure watched, I was made to watch an episode of Black Mirror recently. Anybody see that? Is that a show?
Class with Professor Rockman.
Oh, really? Yeah. Do you know that I've only seen one episode, but it sort of stuck with me. It's the one where a computer programmer has basically made a kind of a Star Trek game. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And this guy in real life is kind of a loser, I guess you would say. But he's been able, so he'll collect the DNA though of his coworkers and put them into the game. And they show up there as like separate people, but with his fantasy attached. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is because this is actually, our ideas about this have become perhaps even more extreme than they were. I mean, nobody really believes that can happen, but we have some idea that you could collect somebody's DNA and sort of make a person out of them, or make the same person out of them in an alternate universe. At least Black Mirror had that idea. And it's very much associated with this idea that we have a whole sort of instructions that have been built into us. Like I said, that would be even more extreme. If someone could collect my DNA and replicate the whole me in somewhere else so that I'm a living person in another place, completely insane. It can't be done actually, but it's perhaps an artifact of our genealogical model. All right, so glad somebody else has seen that. That's just been haunting me for, like I said, I only saw one episode, and now it's haunting me. A relational model is, as Ingold said, it's very much often related to ideas about, I'd say, reincarnation. That there's not a start or stop in points, that life is continually going on, and that life itself is a process of progeneration or perpetual rebirth. Life does not start or stop. To borrow a phrase from Deleuze and Guattari, it is a matter of coming and going rather than starting and finishing. And in this sense, when you die, you're not leaving, or I mean, you are leaving, but you're not disappearing, you're not gone. It's a departure, not a disappearance. So that it's not one, again, on page 143, far from calling for the replacement of one generation by another, death affirms the continuity of the progenerative process, which is a very different, I mean, I think it might even be helpful way to think about things. It might help us to understand or be of some use to us in ways in which people like to cut things off, start them up and cut them off, and this is a different way of understanding. The substance part of things, and we've been talking that all these things are interrelated, you might say. On the substance issue, there's the idea that what you get during that generation process, again, and then there's that Black Mirror part coming in, that the body is simply specified genetically, that it's been outlined as a set of rules or a blueprint or a recipe that makes a body. And similarly, what is handed down in terms of what you get from your inheritance culturally are a bunch of rules or recipes that you're going to follow as a cultural or a social person. And so the substance here in the genealogical model is already specified before that person enters the world. You already have the genetic blueprint, you already have the culture set up. All these things are, like I said, they're like recipes. They're like you can read them in a book and they're already created. Whereas a relational model very much talks to us about every creature being in a field of relationships, and that it is not a substance that is passed on, but it is a process of growing and growth. And that even if there is a recipe, you still have to make the recipe. And for those of you like me who might not be very good at following a recipe, you have to do some improvisation there, make it happen. And so what we see in many places is this idea that people are their paths or their lines. And that's why Ingold got even more perhaps into Deleuze and Guattari, this idea of living out a line of life or a path of life, which is constantly moving and advancing into the world. Ah, yes, page 144. This image of life as a trail or path is ubiquitous among peoples whose existential orientations are found in the practices of hunting and gathering. Image of life as a trail or a path, and that people are known by the paths they lead. And so what is handed down is not rules or recipes, but again, in going back to some material that we've discussed before, the education of attention. So that you're not handing things down, you're orienting yourself. Knowledge, this is page 145, bottom, is not merely applied, but generated in the course of lived experience through a series of encounters in which the contribution of other persons is to orient one's attention along the same lines as their own, so that one can begin to apprehend the world for oneself in the ways that they do. And aligning yourself with the movements of others and perceiving it along and being able to learn for yourself. In terms of memory, the genealogical model, which again is perhaps even more intense now than it was back in the day because of the computers. I think we often have taken on board now an idea that our memory is like is equivalent to a computer memory, a hard drive that we can call up. And the idea that things are in a kind of file cabinet and are contained in our individual heads, and that we store it there. And so that when we remember something, we're going back into our cabinet or into our hard drive or into the RAM and bringing out and developing our information, our pre-existing or the stuff that's already there. Whereas in the relational model, memories are shared, they're forged, they are continually brought forth. It's a very active model of memory. So it's related to a social interaction with an environment, and is very much against the idea of memory as simply a storage cabinet of stuff that you can call up at any point. And I think this time reading through, I was really struck by the relationship between language and involvement and the land and how that works in the relational model. On page 147, Ingold says, a way of speaking is in itself a way of living in the land. The speaking is a way of living in the land. Far from serving as a common currency for the exchange of otherwise private mental representations. So that's the model of language which we often have, that what language is are a bunch of sounds in which I can have an idea, a private representation. I can exchange it with you because we share these words, and then you can recreate that idea in your head. So Ingold is saying, no. Language celebrates an embodied knowledge of the world that is already shared thanks to people's mutual involvement in the tasks of habitation. So what he's saying is you're going along in the world, doing things with other people and talking about them, and the language serves to bring out your skills and your embodiment in the land. And so he says that the language is not ensuring the tradition, rather it is the tradition of living in the land that ensures the continuity of language. And so this has implications for, where people live, and the idea that you can, as Ingold says, that you can take indigenous people from one part of the land and put them in a different place. But that, as Ingold says, it cuts them adrift from the embodied language in the land. So it's a very different idea about language, how we remember things, how we call them up. And it's also a different idea about what it means to have a culture at all. What Ingold is saying here is that you need to keep things going, and that means in some ways drawing upon your experience, the experience of your ancestors, but you also have to keep improvising. You can't just keep things the same, or in the words of Bjorn Bjerkli on page 148, traditionalize the traditional. The effect would be similar to that of a needle becoming stuck in the groove of a record. One could not keep the music going. No. You have LP players, record players. You ever seen one? You've seen it. Yeah. We actually, in the old days, we had one. We bought another one, though. They're coming back. But yes, this metaphor is a little bit old for us in the CD land. We're not even in the CD land, in the MP3 land, in the streaming land. And in the old days, the record would go around, and then the needle has to, you don't want the needle to get stuck. It has to keep going, keep the music going. You can't just get stuck there. Don't know if I have a metaphor for the streaming services. I'll have to think about that. Getting stuck on the same song, I guess. All right. Land. So in the genealogical model of land, Ingold says the land really doesn't have a place. It's just there. It's more like the stage, the backdrop, the place where we act out all the cool stuff that's really going on. And as he puts it in the genealogical model, it basically makes people choose between land and history. And so as on page 139, we can say that, if we talk about indigenous peoples as having a history, then it seems to cut them off from their land. But if their lives are in the land, then their history is collapsed into this imaginary point of origin. So for the genealogical model, the land is a stage upon which is acted a historical pageant consisting of the succession of generations. Whereas in the indigenous model or relational model, the land is intertwined, generative, connected. And instead of being a choice between land and history, where land or history would occur upon the land itself is involved in history and intertwined, so that the land becomes history congealed, which is a super interesting way to put it. Woven like a tapestry. So we have this very stark contrast, or a huge difference between what Ingold posits as the genealogical model and the relational model. But we're met with the paradox, of course, is that, or Ingold tells us that the indigenous peoples in these places are often framing their ideas in terms of the genealogical model, which is kind of strange because as Ingold has told us, the genealogical model is also the colonial model. It's the one that people have when they show up and want to settle in a place. Why do they do this, Willa? Why would they use this genealogical model? The indigenous people. They kind of have to. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit in terms of talking to the state, that Brody has to. As Ingold puts it, they have a genuine dilemma in articulating their aspirations within the hegemonic, overwhelming discourse of their erstwhile oppressors. And so, yeah, he says, as you put it, well, they kind of have to. They don't have any choice because that's the language that is imposed upon them and the categories that are imposed upon them. And this reminded me of something we talked about back a few classes ago, maybe a week or 10 days ago, which is the idea of, who is Western, who is Ingold talking to? And I kind of put out there that I think that it's maybe not, I guess in this chapter, I would say that this is the closest that Ingold comes to saying that what I've sometimes phrased as Western thought, or he's phrasing as Western thought, is really, is very much, we might in today's terms call it a settler colonialist ideology. It's the set of ideas that accompanied the colonial occupation, especially of the Americas, but of other places after that. And it goes back to, again, that debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda, that, do the indigenous people of the Americas have a system, values, and in traditional, in settler colonialists, colonialist ideas or Western thought is that certain people have culture and you don't. And anthropology has responded to this. I mean, and in, I think, often attempting to speak back to certain aspects of this tradition, but the anthropological response is everybody has culture. That's what it means to be human. And I think what Ingold would say is that, or we could put it this way, is it certainly doesn't fundamentally challenge that idea in Western thought. It only extends it out and in some ways imposes it upon other people, which means it's not truly challenging the settler colonial model, at least, even if we're speaking against the worst practices of settler colonialism. Now, as we've talked about, I think Ingold, and he's very explicit in this chapter, that he doesn't want to mess with the politics, and he's simply dealing with the ideas of this situation as a model. And in some ways, of course, we talked about how he's been accused of being a romantic recapture of the wholesomeness of the non-Western times, which I think is slightly fair. But it's also fair to say that if we take the political implications of this, of the kinds of questioning of the settler colonial model, as well as the settler colonial activities, that it potentially has some very profound political implications for how we would organize our societies and how our lives, especially, I hope, if we combined it with an accurate history of the ways in which these groups have been intertwined and interconnected themselves.